The Diplomat's Dagger, a Mick and Mack mystery featuring Rupert Loxley, only on Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast, hosted by Jay Nickel of Nickel Investigations. Act 1, Blood in the Ballroom. Chapter 1, The Last Toast. The ballroom of the King Edward Hotel sparkled like a chandelier in full blush. Champagne flutes tinkled, orchestral strings swelled into the golden light, and diplomats in sashes and stiff smiles glided between tables like ships on a polished sea. It was the kind of event where the silverware weighed more than most people's moral compass. The hors d'oeuvres required translation. McCathie stood near the back, adjusting the stiff collar of the only clean dress shirt he owned. His brown overcoat had been traded for a tux he barely remembered renting, and he looked about as comfortable in it as a cat in a bathtub. "This isn't our scene, Mac," he muttered. "Speak for yourself." MacNeely was already holding his second canapé and had his eye on a third. "They got smoked salmon on rye thins. That's practically a meal." Mick gave him a look. "We're not here to snack." "Then he shouldn't have brought me." The call had come just before 10. A death of the King Eddie, the desk sergeant had said. High level, discreet. They'd been instructed to dress formal. Diplomatic event, international guests, hush-hush. Kind of job where a wrong word started Cold War or ruined someone's cocktail. They made their way toward the far wing of the hotel, past diplomats and delegates and suspiciously cheerful violinists. A uniformed constable stood guard outside a side salon, looking pale and nervous. "Evening, boys," the constable nodded. "Room secured. Victims inside. Chief wants you in there before the press smells blood." Mick ducked under the velvet rope. Mac popped the rest of the canapé into his mouth and followed. Inside, the scene was quietly grim. The salon was small, intimate, expensive. In style, the hotel's turn-of-the-century opulence. Mahogany walls, velvet drapes, and a gilded mirror that now reflected a motionless figure in a diplomatic uniform slumped in a brocade chair. Ambassador Timos Chernik of the Czechoslovak Republic, mid-60s, still gray hair, slicked back, medals gleaming on his chest, and one sash bunched strangely at his side, as though someone had yanked it in a hurry. Dr. Kendall, the city coroner, stood beside the body with his usual thermos of terrible coffee, and a face like someone had ruined his evening opera. "Evening, gentlemen," he said dryly. "Dead less than an hour. No signs of a struggle. But there's blood in the sash and a wound beneath it." Mick crouched beside the chair, lifting the cloth gently. "Stab wound?" "Puncture, precise, clean. This wasn't a bar brawl, it was a message." Mac scanned the room. "Any sign of a weapon?" "None so far," Kendall said. "Might have been ceremonial. He was part of tonight's presentation. Lots of pageantry. Lots of daggers, sabers, enough metals to sink a canoe." Mick stood and glanced at the grandfather clock, ticking solemnly in the corner. "Who found him?" The constable cleared his throat. "That would be Mr. Rupert Loxley." "Name rings a bell," Mick said. "It ought to," came a smooth, lightly amused voice from the doorway. They turned. There, framed in lamplight and charm, stood a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a champagne advertisement and into a murder scene. Midnight blue tuxedo, white silk pocket square, brill-creamed hair parted with architectural precision, and in his hand a teacup. "Rupert Loxley," he said with a slight bow, "cultural attaché to Her Majesty's consulate, and humble witness to this evening's unfortunate climax." Sipped his tea as if nothing in the world could rattle this porcelain. Mick raised an eyebrow. "You found the body?" "Indeed. I stepped out for a glass of port and found our dear ambassador cooling in his chair. Quite inconsiderate of him, frankly. He was due to give a toast." Mac eyed him. "You always bring tea to a murder scene?" Loxley smiled. "Only when the murder scene is short on manners." Mick glanced at Mac. "We've got a body, no weapon, and a ballroom full of people with diplomatic immunity." Mac sighed. "I didn't even get dessert." Chapter 2. Enter Loxley. Rupert Loxley had the kind of smile that could be both an invitation and an alibi. He moved through the scene like it had been decorated for him, one hand in his pocket, the other balancing a bone china teacup, as if he just strolled in from a drawing room instead of a murder investigation. His every word was dipped in Oxford varnish and delivered with the calm assurance of someone who'd never once been late for a train, a duel, or a dinner party. Mick didn't trust him one bit. "You say you were fetching a glass of port?" Mick said, flipping open his notebook. "From where?" "The drawing bar, just off the west wing," Loxley replied. "Though I must confess, the selection was appalling, Portuguese in name only." And he heard something unusual. A soft thump, sort of noise one expects when someone either faints or drops a wine bucket. "And you came in here?" Mac asked, eyes drifting down to Loxley's gleaming cufflinks. "Alone?" "Of course," Rupe said. "I'm nosy by nature. Comes with the job. I found the ambassador slouch rather inelegantly in that chair. I presumed he'd had too much brandy, until I noticed the blood." Mick watched him for a beat. "You touched anything?" "Only my nerves," Loxley quipped. "Though I did check his pulse. I assure you, I've had training in such things." "Medical training?" Mick asked. Rupe tilted his head. "Of a kind. Though in truth, that was more for verifying the absence of life than preserving it. Rather different syllabus." Mac, meanwhile, circled Rupe like a man inspecting a luxury automobile. "That's a nice cut," he said, fingering the lapel of Loxley's jacket. "Tailored?" "Savile. One must look one's best, especially when surrounded by suspects." "You think there are suspects?" Mick asked. "Don't you?" Rupe replied, strolling over the sideboard with casual elegance. "Ambassador Chernick was many things: scholar, diplomat, occasional bore, but above all, a man with enemies. Comes of trying to hold Europe together with paper clips and charm." Poured himself more tea from a silver pot that no one else had dared touch. "Care to elaborate?" Mick asked. Loxley sipped and winced. Hotel tea. Tragic. Mick exhaled slowly, pen tapping against his notebook. "Look, Loxley." "Rupe," the man interrupted cheerfully. "Everyone calls me Rupe." "I'm not everyone," Mick said. "This isn't a garden party. You were alone. You found the body. You're already far too comfortable. Which means you either know more than you're saying, or you're used to scenes like this." Rupe's eyes sparkled. "Detective McCathie, was it? You strike me as a skeptical type. And you," he turned to Mac, "you're the hungry one." "I prefer observant," Mac said, brushing crumbs off his tie. "Well, allow me to offer this," Rupe said, setting his cup down with precision. "Chernick had been under pressure lately, from within his own circles. A rival group of exiles who disagreed with his, shall we say, moderating tone." "Names?" Mick asked. "I'll scribble a few for you. Some rather unpleasant characters, I'm afraid, but do be careful. Politics and murder make terribly flammable bedfellows." "You make this sound like a cocktail game," Mick muttered. "Only the high-stakes ones," Rupe said with a wink. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I'm expected back in the ballroom to look elegantly distressed." He turned to leave, and paused. "Oh, and if either of you need an invitation to the Baltic Society meeting tomorrow evening, I know the hostess. Lovely woman, big on canapes." "Why would we want to go to that?" Mac asked. Rupe flashed his most innocent grin. "Because that's where the next corpse might turn up." He vanished through the door like a magician, folding his silk handkerchief. Mick turned to Mac. "Slippery." Mac nodded. "You gotta admit, guy's got great taste in suits." Chapter 3. Diplomatic Immunities. The ballroom had turned cold. Not in temperature, no, The chandeliers still blazed, the champagne still bubbled, and the music stumbled on with forced grace, but in mood. The kind of chill that settles in when someone realizes murder has RSVP'd to the party. Mick and Mack stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the guests ripple with polite unease. Waiters moved like nervous fish among the diplomats, their trays trembling ever so slightly. Someone was still laughing too loudly at a joke no one had told. That's when you knew things were serious. I've seen less tension in a lion's cage, Mack muttered, adjusting his tie like it was trying to choke him. Lions are less likely to sue you if you look at them, Ron, Mick replied. Scan the guest list in his hand. Half this room could kill a man and walk out the front door with a smile and a consular escort. Anyone on here not packing immunity? Mack asked. Us. The guest list read like a Cold War chessboard. A Soviet trade envoy with a suspicious limp. A British intelligence liaison with a laugh like a foghorn. An American attaché who looked like he'd been carved out of football leather. And a scattering of exiled aristocrats, Eastern Bloc poets, war widows with emeralds the size of golf balls, and that one fellow from Uruguay who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Then there were the Canadians, businessmen who smelled like tobacco and favors, senators who clutched cigars like lifelines, a couple of socialites floating like sequin ghosts, chasing whatever power was closest to the hors d'oeuvres. Anyone in this crowd actually know Chernick? Mack asked. Officially, dozens. Personally, it's hard to say, Mick flipped the list. There are a few names circling the ambassador's itinerary. Tonight he was supposed to meet with, he read aloud, Victor Dobek, Czech exile, journalist, former resistance fighter. Odette Sorel, French cultural advisor, possibly more. Grigory Lashenko, Ukrainian poet / political agitator. And Rupert Loxley. Max snorted. Of course. Guys like gravy, he's into everything. Before Mick could answer, polished voice interrupted. Ah, detectives. Short man in a three-piece suit approached, mustache waxed, eyes unreadable. I'm Chief Protocol Officer Emil Langley, on behalf of the Department of External Affairs. I'm here to ensure this investigation proceeds with the utmost delicacy. Mick glanced sideways at Mack. It usually means don't touch anything. Langley gave a thin smile. You understand the gravity of this incident. But I must impress upon you the diplomatic implications. Ambassador Chernick's death, if mishandled, could be seen as negligence, or worse, interference. Mack crossed his arms. So what do you suggest we do? Fold our arms and hum the national anthem? Interview with care, Langley said, smoothing his cuffs. And for God's sake, don't arrest anyone without clearance from Ottawa. Some of these guests carry more weight than their bodyguards. A nearby waiter passed with a tray. Mack snatched a pastry without breaking eye contact. We'll be careful, Mick said. But someone stuck a knife in a foreign ambassador in a Canadian hotel. That makes it our business, whether their passport glows in the dark or not. Langley gave a tight nod and drifted off, vanishing into a cloud of perfume and policy. Diplomatic immunity, Mack muttered, chewing. Nice work if you can get it. They'll stonewall us with paperwork and tea service, Mick said, scanning the ballroom. Which means we find the pressure points another way. Loxley, Mack asked. Mick nodded. He's already holding court by the piano. Half the room's leaning in when he talks. Mack looked over. Sure enough, Rupe Loxley was smiling at a circle of glittering listeners, gesturing with his teacup like it held state secrets instead of Earl Grey. Caught Mick's gaze, winked, turned back to his audience. Smooth, Mack said. Too smooth, Mick replied. He knows more than he's saying. And if we want to find out what that is, we're going to need an invitation. Mack cracked his knuckles. Then let's go get ourselves one. Act 2, Secrets and Shadows. Chapter 4, The Sash and the Saber. By morning, the gallows glittered, dull to a hangover. In the daylight, the King Edward's salon looked less like a murder scene, more like a furniture catalogue with a dark secret. The body was gone. The blood had been scrubbed with all the urgency of diplomatic embarrassment. But Mick still saw it, the shape of the crime, like a ghost traced in shadows. He stood beside the display case near the center of the room. It was meant to showcase the diplomatic gifts presented during the gala. Carved boxes, ivory ornaments, 3 ceremonial weapons. Only 2 remained. Mick pointed. What's missing? Young assistant curator from the consulate checked her clipboard, visibly nervous. A stiletto, she said. Traditional Czechoslovak design. Steel, inlaid handle. Presented to the ambassador 2 years ago in exile. It was meant to be symbolic. Symbolic how? Mack asked. Courage, resistance, the price of freedom. She hesitated. It's the kind of thing freedom fighters carried when guns were scarce and silence was golden. Silence, Mick repeated. That tracks. He jotted it down. A symbolic weapon, missing from its locked display. And a man stabbed through the heart beneath a sash that was never meant to cover anything more than ceremony. Who had access to the case, he asked. Just the ambassador, the consulate staff, and she checked her list. Mr. Loxley. He was granted temporary clearance to assist with the exhibit arrangement. Mick didn't answer. He just tapped his pencil against his teeth and exhaled. Back in the lounge, Rupe was reclining in a leather armchair that looked like it had given up trying to challenge him. He had changed in a fresh 3-piece charcoal suit, with a carnation lapel that matched precisely nothing in the room, yet made perfect sense. You're up early, Mick said. I never truly go to bed, Rupe replied. Sleep is something I delegate. Tea? No. Suit yourself. It's Darjeeling. Pity. Mack eased in the other chair. You wouldn't happen to know anything about a missing dagger, would you? Only that it's quite rude to steal from a diplomatic display, highly frowned upon in certain circles. Though admit, it does lend a certain panache to the evening's otherwise uninspired decor. Mick sat forward. You had access to the case. So the ambassador, Rupe replied, unbothered. Quite a few others whose names you can't pronounce without pinching your nose. Funny, Mick said. We're starting to think this wasn't just a murder. Might have been a message. Something political. Something personal. Chernak had enemies, Rupe said, growing a touch more serious. Even in Canada. There's a splinter group. Radicals who see him as a traitor to the revolution. They believe in fire over diplomacy. Action over talk. Dangerous men and charmingly paranoid. You know them, Mick asked? I've had drinks with 1 or 2. Professional hazard. I could arrange an introduction, but... He sipped his tea. I strongly recommend you wear something less policey. And don't mention Prague. Mack frowned. Why would you help us? Rupe smiled. Because I dislike amateurs with sharp objects. Because if you fumble this investigation, I'll be stuck attending memorials instead of cocktail receptions. Mick stood straightening his coat. Fine. Set it up. But if this leads us into a trap, I'll personally see to it that your tailor cries. Rupe rose, folding his handkerchief with infuriating precision. Oh, I never walk into traps, gentlemen. I walk around them, with style. He turned and strolled off down the corridor like a man late for a seduction. Mick looked at Mack. Mack shrugged. I still want his tailor's number. Chapter 5. A Very Private Collection. The art gallery of Toronto stood like a stone cathedral of culture, ornate, austere, and just a little too quiet for Mick's liking. It was mid-afternoon when he and Mack arrived, coats flapping in the wind, bringing with them a scent of streetcar grit and police suspicion. It didn't pair well with polished marble floors. The main exhibit featured portraits from pre-war Europe, dignified faces in oil, all staring just off to the left, as though haunted by something no one could name. "Don't trust any painting that doesn't look you in the eye," Mack said, hands in his pockets. "Feels like it's hiding something." "You're not wrong," Mick muttered. "According to the gallery's own register, one of these paintings was flagged in a Czech war crimes dossier back in '46. Stolen art. Supposed to be in government custody. Now it's hanging in a borrowed frame under soft lighting." "And guess who used to own it?" Mack asked. "Ambassador Chernik," Mick replied. "Back when he was just a professor in Prague. The Nazis took it, then the Soviets. Then, who knows? But here it is, back in Toronto, and he didn't bring it." The gallery's research room was tucked behind a locked brass door marked Archives, staff only. It didn't stop Edward Thornton from greeting them like old friends, spectacles perched on his nose and a rare smile warming his otherwise bookish features. "I'm afraid we have more questions than answers," he said, gesturing for them to follow. "The painting came in through an anonymous donor 2 months ago. No documentation, no formal ceremony. Slipped in the collection as part of a Czech modernist donation." "Any chance it was forged?" Mick asked. "That's why I called in Nick." They stepped into a smaller room, where Nick Hawthorne stood in a pool of lamplight, sleeves rolled to the elbow, peering at the canvas through a jeweler's loupe. He looked like a man who could spot a lie at 100 paces, and iron it flat with a silk press. "It's real," Nick said without looking up. "Cracking, varnish, brushstroke tapering. It's authentic. Early Yuri John. But the signature's been touched up. Someone tried to obscure the ownership mark." "Why?" Mack asked. "Because ownership is history. And history, gentlemen, is dangerous." He finally looked up. "This painting didn't just turn up. Someone brought it here on purpose. Someone who didn't want Chernik to know. Or did." Footsteps echoed in the hallway behind them. "Now this is what I call ambiance," came a familiar voice. "Dim lighting, forbidden history, and brooding detectives. Delicious." Rupert Loxley stepped into the room, looking perfectly at home. His trench coat hung like it had been cut for espionage, and he carried a folded umbrella he hadn't used. Mick sighed. "How did you get in?" "I told the security desk I was with the foreign minister's delegation. Honestly, your country's access policies are charmingly naive." "You're not with the foreign minister's delegation," Thornton said flatly. "I'm with everyone," Rupe said, eyes flicking to the painting. "Ah, I thought I recognized it. I saw it once, above a fireplace in Prague, just before the Germans arrived. Tense evening, lots of port, a little light treason." Nick arched an eyebrow. "You were in Prague in '39? "I've been lots of places," Rupe replied, brushing invisible lint from his lapel. "But this is a message. The ambassador's past, resurrected. Someone wanted him rattled, maybe worse." "Could he have brought it here himself?" Mick asked. Rupe shook his head. "Not unless he smuggled it in with a diplomatic pouch the size of a piano. He'd never let it out of his hands if he did." Mack frowned. "So who did?" Nick tapped the canvas. "Whoever it was knew how to make it look like a legitimate acquisition. It left just enough of a trail to be found. Like they wanted it discovered." "Or to frame someone," Thornton added. Mick narrowed his eyes. "Either way, it links to Chernik. It's turning his murder into a political powder keg." Rupe looked genuinely thoughtful for a moment, which was somehow more alarming than his usual smirk. "There's one more place you should look," he said. "The Baltic Society's private archive. They collect sensitive items, documents, relics, art, things with long shadows. I can get you in." "Why are you helping us?" Mick asked again. Rupe offered his umbrella like a gentleman offering an arm. "Because murder is easy. But the truth is an art. And I like to collect it. Chapter 6. Whispers at the Club. Mac didn't like tailing people. He liked watching people, sure. He liked eavesdropping. He liked side doors and bad coffee and cold cars. And he especially liked the part of the end where you got to say, "You're under arrest." But tailing? No thanks. It required subtlety, patience, shoes that didn't squeak when you walked past marble fireplaces. And the Caravel Club was all marble fireplaces. The place looked like something out of an old spy novel. Polished wood paneling, heavy curtains, scent of pipe smoke, and generational wealth. Membership required either an ancestral title or a willingness to commit international fraud over a bottle of Bordeaux, possibly both. Mac had followed Victor Dobek, the Czech exile turned newspaper columnist, from the gallery to this hush-hush haunt of diplomats and retired devils. Dobek had looked over his shoulder twice. Not enough to spook a regular tale, but enough to suggest he knew he wasn't alone. Mac ditched his coat with a skeptical cloakroom attendant and stepped into the lounge proper. Everything was dim. Purposefully dim. Like they were hiding wrinkles, secrets, or both. Men in tailored suits murmured in groups of 2 or 3, their eyes doing most of the talking. A silver tray floated by in the arm of a server who looked like he was trained to defuse grenades with a napkin. Mac kept his distance, pretending to nurse a gin he hadn't ordered, and watched Dobek duck into a curtained side room. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Then, raised voices, a rustle, a sharp thud. Mac moved, fast and quiet, pushing through the curtain, only to be grabbed from behind. 2 figures had been waiting in the cloakroom. One of them, a square-jawed man with the neck of a bulldozer, slammed Mac into the coat rack. Hangers clattered. Mac swung a left that connected with something soft and important, but a third man grabbed him by the collar and twisted hard. "Tell your people," growled a Slavic accent, hot and sharp against his ear. "The Baltic memo does not leave this building." "What memo?" Mac barked. A fist cocked back. And then, just as quickly, "Gentlemen, please, not the trench coat." The voice came silk smooth and dry as a London martini. Rupe Loxley stepped into the cloakroom like it was a theater and the curtain had just gone up. He carried a slim cane he didn't need and a folded handkerchief he did. The suit was, as ever, immaculate, not a crease out of place. The 3 men hesitated. "You're making a dreadful mess," Rupe said, brushing a speck from his sleeve, "and you're attracting attention. Tisk, tisk." Bulldozer next sneered. "This isn't your affair." Rupe tilted his head. "Ah, but everything in this club is technically my affair. I sponsored Mac here as a guest. You lay hands on him, you insult my honor." And pause. "And if you insult my honor, I shall be forced to challenge you to a duel, and I'm told I'm very good with pistols." His smile did not reach his eyes. Bulldozer backed down first. The others followed, disappearing in the velvet hush like cigarette smoke. Rupe turned to Mac, who was brushing himself off and muttering curses in 3 languages. "You all right?" Rupe asked, offering a hand. "I've had better coat checks," Mac grumbled, taking it. "The hell's the Baltic memo?" "A rumor, a whisper. A diplomatic landmine wrapped in an old typewriter ribbon," Rupe said. "And if it's real, it could topple half the embassy staff in Ottawa. And you, my dear Mac, just waltzed into a backroom poker game with a live grenade." "Dobek?" Mac asked. "Gone," Rupe said. "Out the back. 5 minutes ago. Left a cigar stub and a half-drunk cognac. Very Cold War of him." "And you?" Mac narrowed his eyes. "How'd you get in?" "I'm on the board," Rupe said with a wink. "Do let me know if you need a sponsor. The breakfasts are dreadful, but the gossips is sublime." Before Mac could answer, Rupe was already vanishing down the corridor, cane tapping faintly on the tiles. Mac straightened his tie and stepped back into the main lounge. Somewhere, a string quartet resumed playing something that sounded expensive and tragic. He sighed. "You all right?" came Mick's voice from the far side of the room, holding 2 coats and a raised eyebrow. "I think I just got half a clue. A bruised shoulder and a thank you note from Cary Grant." Act 3. The Blade and the Bluff. Chapter 7. A Dagger to the Heart. Dr. Kendall stood over his desk like a priest delivering bad news to the unrepentant. His lab coat was dusted with chalk from some poor soul's remains, and the faint aroma of overcooked coffee clung to him like a second skin. The morgue's basement office was a far cry from the King Edward's glittering ballroom, but this was where the real post-mortems happened. Mick and Mack waited across from him, notepad ready, pens uncapped. Kendall tapped a long, thin blade encased in a clear evidence bag. "Gentlemen, you're looking at a Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife. British make, specifically designed for close quarters combat. Triangular blade, leaves a deep, tidy puncture with minimal external bleeding, but maximum internal damage." "Not exactly ceremonial," Mick said. "No," Kendall replied. "This wasn't for show. It was for war." Mac squinted at the stiletto. "How to get past the sash?" "Easy," Kendall said. "The killer didn't come in waving it. This thing's designed to be worn flat against the body, concealed, silent, efficient, and fatal. Instantly in this case, straight between the ribs, up into the heart. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Mick exhaled slowly. "Military?" "More than that," came a voice from the doorway. "Covert." They turned. Evelyn, Eve Whitmore, stood in the entrance, arms crossed, her trench coat unbuttoned just enough to suggest she hadn't come for a social call. Her lipstick was immaculate, her expression wasn't. "I've seen that blade before," she said. "We called it the Widowmaker. British SOE issued them to agents in Europe. Light, deadly, untraceable." "You carried one?" Mac asked. "Once," she said. "But mine didn't vanish from a Czech exhibit and turn up in a corpse. That's a different kind of statement." Eve stepped closer and looked down the stiletto. "This isn't just a knife, it's a calling card. Whoever used it wanted someone to know exactly how this man died." Mick didn't have to say it. The thought was already hanging in the air. Rupe. He had the training. He had the access. He had a past wrapped in secrets and a wardrobe tailored for vanishing. Charming, slippery, unflappable Rupe. And now he was standing in the center of a crime scene with fingerprints made of silk, and a motive wrapped in international mystery. "Think it's him?" Mac asked Eve. She hesitated. "I think it could be. But that's the trouble with men like Rupert Loxley. They never lie outright. They just tell the truth sideways." Mick frowned. "If this knife ties to SOE work, who else besides Rupe would have had one? Dozens, maybe more. Ex-agents, black market collectors, intelligence officers with long memories and short morals. But the people who'd use it this cleanly, that's a very short list. And Loxley's at the top of it." Eve gave a soft, reluctant nod. "He may not be the killer, but I guarantee he knows who is." Mick stared at the knife again. The blade was cold and clinical, designed for shadow wars and crumbling cities, not for a ballroom. Unless, of course, the ballroom was the battlefield. Chapter 8. The Dossier Game. Suite 714 at the King Edward Hotel was a kind of room that came with its own silence. Heavy curtains dulled the city noise, thick carpet absorbed footsteps, and the fireplace crackled like it was reading the room. A bottle of scotch waited on a sideboard, 3 glasses untouched, one man pacing in perfect loops as if orchestrating his own shadow. Rupert Loxley. He wasn't smiling. Mick and Mack sat across from him in matching armchairs that cost more than Mack's car. Eve stood near the window, arms folded, eyes fixed on the man who'd slipped through every net they'd thrown. "So," Mick said, "you're going to tell us what you've been dancing around since the ambassador bled out in his brocade chair?" Rupe paused mid-turn, then gave a slight nod. Not a bow this time, something smaller. He looked tired, a man caught between masks. "All right," he said. "Cards on the table, though some are redacted." "Start talking," Mac said, voice flat. Rupe crossed to the fireplace, poured himself a scotch, and turned to face them. His voice had none of the flippant charm they'd come to expect. Just steel under silk. "After the war, a few of us stayed on unofficially. We weren't spies, not anymore, just cleaners, sweepers. We tied up loose ends, tracked down fascists who'd swapped armbands for embassy badges, recovered documents before they fell into Soviet hands. Quiet work." "And Chernik?" Mick asked. "He helped us," Rupe said. "Reluctantly, but effectively. He was a human Rolodex of exiled diplomats, forged treaties, missing art, ghost agents. The Baltic memo," he nodded at Eve. "You know what it is?" Eve nodded. "An inventory. Stolen documents, names, safe house locations, technology transfers. Rumored to be worth its weight in political leverage." Rupe took a drink. "He helped us hide it, or rather, parts of it. We scattered it across embassies, consulates, even galleries. Chernik had one piece encoded in a ledger. I was trying to retrieve it quietly." "Someone beat you to it," Mick said. Rupe gave a small, dry laugh. "Yes, only they didn't ask nicely." "Why didn't you just tell us?" Mac asked. "Because if I walked in waving a dossier with half the secrets of the Cold War, I'd be dead before dessert, and you'd be caught in the crossfire." "Sounds like we are anyway," Mick said. Rupe sat down his glass, reached into his jacket and pulled out a warm manila folder. He tossed it on the coffee table with a thud. Stamped on the front, "Diplomatic travel authorization. Emergency use only." Inside, a forged Czechoslovakian passport. Fresh ink, recent photo. "Who is it?" Mick asked. "Grigory Lashenko," Rupe said. "Poet, patriot. Or so he pretended. Chernik discovered Lashenko had been feeding intel to Moscow under the guise of pan-Slavic cultural outreach. He confronted him. Lashenko panicked. The knife, I suspect, was already on him." Eve opened the folder, studying the passport. "It's good. Almost perfect. But this paper stock's Canadian, not Czech. Whoever made this had access to a local forgery ring." Mick leaned forward. "You're saying Lashenko stabbed Chernik and was planning to flee?" "Yes," Rupe said. "The final piece of the Baltic memo hidden in that painting at the gallery. The one Chernik never knew had resurfaced." Max scratched his chin. "So why isn't Lashenko run?" Rupe smiled faintly. "Because he doesn't know we found the passport. He doesn't know his escape route's being compromised." "You set a trap," Mick said. "I set a stage," Rupe corrected. "But I'll need you two to write the ending." Chapter 9. Curtain Call to King Eddie. The King Edward Hotel traded glitter for grief. The ballroom was lit in low amber tones, soft enough to flower the mourners and blur the politics. Strings played something wistful, the waiters wore black, and the champagne flowed not to celebrate, but to soften. A makeshift portrait of Ambassador Timos Chernik stood near the lectern, flanked by white lilies and diplomats who had known him nearly as well as he claimed. Mick and Mack stood at the back of the room, suits pressed, eyes sharp. "You ready for this?" Mack asked. Mick nodded. "The man's already stabbed someone in a room full of witnesses. Let's see if he tries to bluff a crowd of mourners." At the far end of the ballroom, Grigory Lashenko worked the floor with snake oil grace. The Ukrainian poet turned cultural attaché moved from guest to guest, like a man trying to charm away suspicion. He wore a silk tie and a sorrowful expression, both of which were counterfeit. Rupe's forged passport sat snugly in Mick's inner pocket. They waited for the lull, for the moment when the wine ran out and the room paused to adjust its moral compass. Then Mick stepped forward, calm, casual, professional. "Mr. Lashenko," he said, "you left your coat in the cloakroom the night of the ambassador's murder." Lashenko turned, smile freezing mid-performance. I don't recall." "No," Mack interrupted, lifting a silver ice bucket off a side table. He reached inside and pulled out a long, slender blade, still damp from the champagne cooler. "'Cause someone hid this in your bottle of Dom Perignon." Gasps flitted through the room like startled birds. Lashenko's eyes narrowed. "That proves nothing," he snapped. Mick held up the passport. "And this? Brand new travel documents, issued to a dead man." Lashenko's mouth opened and closed. A beat passed, then two. He turned to run. Mack moved first, intercepting him with a clean body check near the dessert table. The crowd parted like a polite sea foam. Mick followed, cuffing Lashenko without drama. A scattering of applause broke out, mostly from the Canadian delegation. Mick shook his head. "Never fails. Wait for the toast, catch the killer." Mack dusted his jacket. "Do we get to finish the memorial snacks, or are we getting kicked out again? I think that depends on how charming our mutual friends feeling." Epilogue. Tea and daggers. The suite was quieter now. The fire burned low, and the city outside whispered its midnight song. Mick leaned against the windowsill, polishing his notes. Mack dozed in a wing-back chair, one shoe off and one eye still open. The door clicked softly. Rupe Loxley stepped inside with a fresh cup of Earl Grey and an unbothered smile. "I spoke to Ottawa," he said. "They're willing to pretend none of this happened, provided we pretend it was handled gracefully." Mick didn't look up. "And you?" "I'll be seen having a public disagreement with someone important and quietly reassigned. Paris, perhaps, or Lisbon. I hear the coffee's dreadful, but the espionage is divine." He sipped. "Consider the storm smoothed." Mick finally looked up. "You're slippery as an eel in silk gloves. And I take that as the compliment it was meant to be." Mack stirred. "Yeah, well, you're our eel. I still want the number of your tailor." Rupe smiled. "I'll have him send you a card." He turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to raise his cup in half salute. "Gentlemen, until the next dagger." The door closed behind him. Mick and Mack sat in the hush for a long moment. Then Mack reached for the last biscuit on the tray. "So what do you figure the odds are that he didn't kill someone else this week?" Mick smirked. "Let's hope he's too well dressed to get caught." This has been another episode of the Mick and Mack Mysteries, only on Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast. Stay tuned for more tales of murder, mischief, and mystery, straight from the streets of post-war Toronto. Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast, available wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Subscribe to Ontario Cold Cases today so you never miss an episode. Please share your thoughts and questions in the comments.